Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, madam.
Hope you all had a good weekend. The time is now 9:30 and I shall resume this inquiry into the appeal made by Dignity Funerals Limited against the decision of Doncaster Council to refuse planning permission for a crematorium, including memorial gardens, car parking, a new vehicle access onto Green Lane, and ancillary works at land south of Green Lane, Brodsworth, Doncaster. This is the 5th day of the inquiry. Can I just check that everyone can see and hear me okay? Just the usual reminders to switch mobile phones off or put them to silent, and for the council to keep the attendance sheet and send that through to Robert, please. We shall aim to break for lunch around 1 p.m. and finish, if at all possible, by 5 p.m. And I'll ask the advocates to advise in terms of suitable times for mid-morning, mid-afternoon breaks. So just a few procedural matters before we get started. Just say thank you for your revised timings. I've circulated the updated timetable, so I hope you all have a copy of that. Are there any comments on that timetable? I mean, it looks as though we should thank you for the time savings, as it looks as though we'll now get through the main evidence by close of play on Thursday, unless Mr. Barrett is going to tell me otherwise, or Mr. Village.
Ma'am, I'm not going to tell you otherwise. I think the time estimates are correct. There's one slight typographical error. I think the order of closing speeches should be well, not so much a typographical error. The order for closing speeches, I think, is me, then Mr. Robson, then Mr. Village.
Yes, I do apologise. I've been cutting and pasting a little bit there. I shall get that corrected and send it through. Mr. Village.
I regret to say that we haven't seen the timetable for whatever reason. I don't know why.
Okay. I did ask Robert to send it through, and obviously Mr. Barrett's received it. Mr. Robson, have you received it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Might be worth double checking emails, Mr. Village, or I can ask.
Has it been through to Mr. Land of Clyde and Co?
I don't know, because the case officer sent it. Who would you like it resent to, Mr. Village? And I'll see if I can sort that out for you.
We'll email the case officer.
We'll go to the case. We'll speak to this case officer direct and.
Right. Okay.
Rather than sorting it out.
Okay, but in summary, it's looking positive, Mr. Village, that we'll finish the main evidence, including the planning evidence, by close of play on Thursday, site visit on Friday, and then probably conditions and closing submissions either, what day do we say, 30th of November or 1st of December. So I think we've asked all advocates to keep those dates protected in their diaries. I don't know if there's a preference for those. We can maybe discuss it at the end of this week's proceedings. But that's where we are with the timetable at the moment. So I've just noticed, Mr. Job, you've got your hand up. Did you have a question at this point? Oh, Mrs. Job, I apologise.
Yeah, it's all right, it's all right. I get it. Mum, just on the closing statements on that very last day, the joint rural parishes really would quite like an opportunity as well, if possible, to say something, maybe some sort of closing comments that we'd like to participate in it. Would that be possible?
It's usually, that session is usually reserved for, you know, for the main parties. To be fair, if you were to say something, you would need to go before the appellant's closing submissions. But yeah, it wouldn't normally be wouldn't be usual practice. I'm happy to take soundings from the parties to see whether there would be any objection to that. Probably more from Mr. Village.
Yes, I mean, we wouldn't see any reason to depart from the usual practice. The joint rural parishes are not a Rule 6 party, and therefore, although Mr. Job is participating in asking the odd question, I don't think that gives her any entitlement to make a closing submission or add to her the representations which she's also already lucidly provided to you.
Just on that point, Mr. Village, I don't think we sort of resolved the issue of whether you're going to be asking questions or doing some kind of rebuttal to the submissions by the joint rural parishes. After there was a summary of the statement. Have you taken a view on that, Mr. Village, just from a timetable point of view as well?
Well, the view I took was that we would want to try and see if we can cover everything in the other evidence, and I'm hopeful that we will. Insofar as we don't, then it may be that we do put in a written representation by way of response. But at this stage, I don't intend to cross-examine this job.
Okay, thank you. So really, unless there's a burning desire, Mrs. Job, I would say it would depart from normal practice. Closing submissions are generally for the main parties. So I did allow quite a lot of leeway on the first day of the
I know you
inquiry,
did.
Mrs.
I know
Job.
you did. It's just that as interested parties, we're obviously participating all the way through, and we just felt that it would be nice to be given the opportunity for us to make some comments at the end as well, Mum.
Okay, well, I mean, you have my initial view on that, but obviously I shall give that some consideration and may get back to you at a later point. And have you received a copy of the timetable, Mrs. Job, as well?
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Mum. We've got a copy of the timetable and the site visit itinerary. I've just got a couple of things just on that, if I may. The two visual receptors that we asked the inspector if she would include on her visit, they seem to be omitted at the minute. They're not on the list. And that was the views from the first floor cottages, which are on a higher elevation in Pickburn Lane, and houses on Parkview on Brodsworth Road. That's an extension of Pickburn Lane. We looked at the itinerary on points visits 12 and visits 13. You virtually go past the end of those houses when you're heading towards Brodsworth Hall. So I didn't know whether that might be an opportune time to include it between those two, 12 and 13, Mum.
So sorry, just repeat the two visual receptors, views from
the cottages on the first floor on the higher elevation in Pickburn Lane, and houses on Parkview on Brodsworth Road.
The first point you mentioned from the first floor, that would obviously involve gaining access.
What the lady that I've asked happens to be one of the ladies and one of the colleagues of the joint rural parishes, so that's already been approved, Mum. She's happy for that to happen.
Okay, can I take the views of parties whether there are any objections to that suggestion? That's 2 points. Mr. Barrett?
None from me, ma'am. Obviously, if you're entering private property, then all the parties will have to have permission to go onto that private property.
So she doesn't mind us traipsing through the house.
In fact, if you remember when the little dog was barking, that's her dog. So she's used to people being in and out of the house now.
Okay. Well, if there aren't any objections, Mr. Village, then I shall include those in and recirculate that. Apologies for missing those out, Mrs. Job.
And just with regards to the site visit, normally at this time of year, the hedges around the entire field, and I don't just mean the site where we're talking about in terms of development, but the entire field would normally be cut and trimmed to a lower level at this time of year. As you'll see when you're going round, Mum, unfortunately this particular field that in this area hasn't actually been cut as yet, so that the hedges are higher than they normally would be with regards to views across the field. And I just asked the inspector if she would bear that in mind as she goes round, please.
Okay, thank you. And are you joining us on the site visit, Mrs. Job?
It won't be me, it will be one of my colleagues, Mum.
Are they here today? It's just we're going to be discussing in a moment. You've stolen my thunder a bit there, Mrs. Job, but we're going to be moving on to the site visit item and meeting times. I'm just thinking in terms of making arrangements.
They should be online. I think Pam Moorhouse is online.
Okay. Right. Well, if you can bear with me, I just need to discuss the timings with the main parties. Yes, I mean, obviously, with those additions, if I could have the main parties back, please. The site visit is penciled in for Friday. I haven't put in a start time yet because I need to take soundings from those who will be attending. Now, I've decided to travel down on the Thursday night just to avoid. I got caught in traffic jams last time, so it was a bit precarious in terms of trying to get there for a certain time. So I'm probably more flexible, but in terms of the other parties travelling to the site and the distance that they have to travel, what time it would be a good start time for the other parties. Mr. Robson, I'm assuming your witness, one of your witnesses at least, will be local to the area. What about Ms. Oxley?
Ma'am, I think it is Mrs. Suddies who will be on the site visit. She unfortunately is not logged in this morning as she has another appointment to attend for the first hour or so. I don't think it will be a problem. I think a 10 o'clock start should be fine, but would you mind if I just make contact with her to confirm?
Yeah. 10 shoots more of an issue for the other parties. Mr. Village, in terms of your landscape witness, is 10 o'clock acceptable? Does it need to be later for travelling time, or?
10 o'clock's fine for us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good. Mr. Barrett?
And a fine for us, it will be Mr. Taylor, Mr. Carl Taylor, who will be attending on our behalf.
Brilliant. So 10 o'clock at Brodsworth Community Woodland Car Park. Miss Morehouse, I'm assuming that's okay for you as your local.
I can speak on behalf of Mrs. Moorhouse, if I may. She'll be fine with that, Mum, because as she lives there, it'll be fine.
Right, that's fine. That's great. So that concludes, I think, the site visit arrangements. Other than Jackdaw Wood, obviously there would need to be arrangements with being private land to allow access onto that land. That wouldn't normally be my task, so I'm looking for a volunteer to help arrange that.
Yes, ma'am. The council can arrange access.
Okay, and I have put a note on in terms of Brodsworth Hall, whether it's just worth warning them that we may be on our way. There'd be quite a handful of us, just to make sure we can access the hall itself.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Right. Were there any other points in relation to the site visit? No. Okay, so just before we start, are there any other people who wish to speak today who've not already indicated that they wish to do so? No. Any other procedural or housekeeping matters? Okay. So on Friday, Mr. Hodgson gave evidence in chief. So Mr. Village, you can now commence your cross-examination of Mr. Hodgson. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good morning, Mr. Hodgson.
Good morning.
Mr. Hodgson, you claim expertise as a demographics expert. Do you hold any recognised professional qualifications?
No, sir.
In demographics, other than having prepared several need assessments?
No, so I have no recognisable qualifications outside of my experience.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not really accurate to say you're an expert. I mean, someone who may be interested in football or follow a football team may have views on which team is up and which team is down and which players should be playing, but that doesn't make them an expert, does it?
I would say that that's a matter of viewpoint. What I am an expert in demographic terms is understanding how to relate data to performance. So how to relate data that is theoretical in a need assessment and then reconciling it to how a crematorium actually performs in reality. Well, so I would say that that is a unique skill set that would make me an expert. Of course, we can agree to disagree.
Well, I'm not agreeing to disagree or agreeing to agree. I'm just asking questions of you, Mr. Hodgson, just to understand why it is you claim to be an expert in a matter, because of course in giving evidence, experts take on a particular role and have a particular duty to the court or the inquiry. And I think it's fair to say that you're not what one might call an acknowledged expert in any aspect of the matters with which we're here concerned, but you have certainly got some experience in, which is undeniable, in the funeral industry and, as you say, the performance of crematoria.
Is there a question in there, Mr. Village?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fairly obvious question. I said to you that you clearly you don't have you're not an acknowledged expert, are you, in terms of how a court or a public inquiry would consider an expert?
Well, I would say actually that I wouldn't agree with that based on the experience that I've had. But of course, you are setting a parameter of defining that would agree with your statement. I mean, if it helps you in the context of this position, I have no qualification for GIS.
No, and I think it's also fair to say that you don't have, you're not a member of any professional body which regulates you.
Correct.
Yeah. Good. And so far as Active Exchange Limited is concerned, we know and are told nothing about who or what they are we?
what would you like to know?
Well, I mean, for example, who is the author? What is their qualifications? What is their expertise in offering a report which sits as an appendix to your evidence?
I have no issue whatsoever in providing that information. It's actually put together by Sheila Kwan, who is probably the most experienced GIS expert in the market of GIS. She's instructed by the actual owner of the company Active Exchange, which is Alex Burrows. And I'm more than happy to provide professional CVs of both those individuals to this inquiry if helpful.
Well, you haven't done so. I'm not asking you to add to your evidence, and it's late to do so. I'm just observing that we don't know, there's nothing before the inquiry as to who they are or what their expertise is, if any.
Well, Mr. Village, respectfully, I mean, those company records are on the record. So, but I'm more than happy to provide that for you, Mr. Village. I would also equally say that they have provided, and Sheila herself has provided GIS work for Memoria Limited for over 12 years and has provided all of the information before every appeal that I have sat at. So I have no issue with Active Exchange or Sheila Kwan's credibility. There's no question of it.
Well, I mean, you just mentioned the record, and as it happens, I did research the record of Active Exchange Limited, which was incorporated as a company in 2020, wasn't it?
Correct.
However, they purported to produce the need assessment in respect of your own site, Barnby Dun, in 2019, and it's produced by Active Exchange Limited, a company which then, in fact, didn't exist.
Well, it definitely, or another form of it will certainly have existed, Mr. Village. I mean, there is no question on the expertise of Active Exchange and the consultant that they've used. They've used the name Leisure Markets, they've used the name For Global, but the GIS behind it is incredibly accurate and well established. It's not a problem to provide any of the things that you're asking for, but I find the line of questionings on this slightly odd.
Well, I'm trying to understand what lies behind it, and we'll come on to whether it'd be a matter for Mr. Barrett to comment on whether these questions are rather odd in due course, because as we're going to see, and as I will demonstrate shortly, there is quite a degree of conflict in the evidence that you provide and, for example, Mr. Mitchell provides as to population data and so on, isn't there?
There are definite differences, and of which I'm more than happy for you to ask me questions about.
Okay, so let's just turn to Mr. Mitchell's evidence, please. Paragraph 9.49. And
9.49, did you say?
Yeah.
I have that.
Which is figure 15. And we'll look at scenario 2, which is the scenario which looks at Barnby Dun and Rose Hill. So it assumes that Barnby Dun is in operation, yes?
Correct. I have that.
And he identifies a population for Barnby Dun of 146,857.
Yes.
And Rose Hill of 163,000. Yeah.
I have those. Yes, agreed.
Yeah. And if we just pause there, turn to your evidence.
Yeah.
And your table 3.1, which is, I think, on
page 8.
Page 8, thank you. That gives a figure for Barnby Dun of 135,000, and for Rose Hill of 181,000. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
So, I mean, already we're seeing significant differences between you and Mr. Mitchell in terms of the assumed population areas, aren't we?
We are, and I'll let you ask a question, but we are seeing a difference.
Yeah,
but I'm very comfortable in why we see those differences, of which I'm sure you're going to ask me about.
And you what this goes to demonstrate is that when we're looking, and when the inspector's making a judgment about issues of need, let's take need first, it's actually much more reliable and also consistent to take the actual death rate in any particular area rather than looking at the populations. So actual deaths is a clear indication of precisely what the need in any particular area is, isn't it? It's a much better assessment. Where
no, okay, sorry, Mr. Village, you completed your question because I don't want to cut across you.
Yeah.
Was that the end?
Yes, that was the end.
Apologies.
What I said was it.
Apologies, I think there's a bit of a delay, so apologies on that. Mr. Village, no, I don't agree with that point at all. I think that the GIS that you use can be very accurately put together, and the differences between us and ArcGIS is the software that's being used by the council. That is the same GIS product that's being used by the appellant in this case. And so there is no surprise to me that there are similarities between the council's evidence and the appellant's. It is my view. Can I answer, please, Mr. Village?
Sorry, you, as you rightly pointed out, there seems to be a little delay, and I popped in at a pause, but
that's all right. I'm sorry. It is my view that the Map Info professional software that we use, which removes motorways from the calculation, is the major difference that we see between these two GISs. And to answer your question directly, do I think it is more accurate to use death rates that have happened in a certain set of years rather than redrawing the catchment areas to be reflective of the minimum distance catchment? No, I don't agree with that at all. I actually think it is inaccurate to use numbers that have already happened because they assume that those crematoria haven't been built. And we know consistently from looking at how crematoria impact different areas once they are built, is that it's much more accurate to look at the redrawn catchment areas.
No, I think you misunderstand what I'm suggesting, because obviously in relation to what I'm suggesting is that it's more accurate to look at actual deaths within a given area as defined on a map than it is to look at population. That's what
you have to look at both, Respectfully, Mr. Village, you can't look at just one over the other. What catchments do is that they give you a very clear note of the size of gaps in service. And so, of course, you can see the amount of people that will benefit from a scheme. So that in itself is a very useful measure.
Well, hang on a moment. I wasn't asking about qualitative considerations, because there's another way of looking at qualitative considerations, Mr. Hodgson, and that's to look at actual cremation rates. In other words, how many people are being cremated at individual crematoria. And again, that is clearly identified in, it's a matter of, it's a requirement of law for crematoria to identify the numbers of people that each of them cremate. And so again, one has a much more accurate assessment of qualitative considerations by looking at actual death rates, doesn't one?
No, I don't agree.
No.
I don't agree, because I think you have to look at all of these factors. There is no arbitrary way of doing it, but there is a clear indications that can be given by looking at what has been done previously, not just in terms of what is consented, but what then goes on to happen after that consent has been awarded and a site has been built. And that in itself is the way to do it most accurately, not just to look at death rates or cremation rates.
Well, let's see as to what sort of difficulties we can get into if we rely on populations. And I think I'd invite you to go to your the map at page 7 of your evidence, please. It's map 1.1.
Yep.
And I think it's right to say that this is a map taken from the active exchange report, isn't it?
That's correct, sir. That's correct.
Yes. Now, in respect of Barnsley and Pontefract and Rotherham and Rose Hill, the catchment areas are all very clearly defined by black lines. But the catchment area in relation to the Barnby Dun crematorium has a number of black lines running through it, doesn't it?
Yes, sir, I can tell you what they are. They are watercourses. So they're not relevant in terms of the catchment area.
Well,
They're
it's strange that
go through.
Well, surprised if that is what they are, rather than something else which I might suggest to you in a moment. But I'm not sure it really matters, because I just want the inspector to understand precisely what the extent of the Barnby Dun catchment area being identified on this plan is. It's difficult, and this is where, of course, we have some disadvantages with a virtual system, where I can't just hold something up and point to it, or come to your desk and show you and show the inspector. But let's do the best we can as to what it extends to. I mean, it could be perhaps done as easily as saying that we can see what the Pontefract isochrome is fairly clearly. I mean, Pontefract is not divided up by squiggly lines. It's one big area, isn't it?
Absolutely, but as I've just said, Mr. Village, it's not difficult to discern. If you look at where the barrier between the edge of the Pontefract, as you just rightly pointed out, is very clear, and you go along the line with Barnby Dun, that is the western edge of that catchment area for Barnby Dun. The lines within Barnby Dun are watercourses.
Okay.
Therefore, they are shown because you don't have a road that goes over them, but the catchment itself is defined.
Well, that's a strange suggestion if there's no road that goes over them, because there is a line which divides up the catchment area. It comes down in a sort of a dog leg. If one's looking at it, it's almost like a figure 5 or an S shape going straight through the middle. Do you see that?
Yes, I do see.
You're saying that's a watercourse.
Yes,
that's a watercourse over.
It's a watercourse that impacts.
Sorry, I think you're interrupting me now,
Apologies.
Mr. Hodgson.
Apologies, Mr. The delay.
Shall I start again?
Please do.
It's a figure 5, and it's what you say is a watercourse over which there is no road. Is that right?
It's a watercourse which is being identified, and within the rest of the catchment, you can see where it expands to. So where it goes out to the edge of Pontefract, to the edge of Rosehill, and to the edge of Woodlands, that is the Barnby Dun catchment area. Well, so the lines within the Barnby Dun catchment area are not a redefinition of any catchments. The overall line that goes around the edge of it is the edge of its catchment.
The road, you say, there is no road that goes over those watercourses. Do you want to stand? Do you want to stand by that statement?
Could you give me the statement again, please?
You told me a moment ago that the watercourses are shown because no road goes over them. I said, do you want to stand by that statement?
No, sorry, that isn't. Did I actually say those words?
Yes.
I don't think I said those words. Well, if I did, then those are not right. What they show is the watercourses. Okay, they show the watercourses.
Okay, so and that is said to be the minimum drive catchment area, isn't it?
That's correct.
And I think we can see, if we turn to the active exchange report, that it's that plan is taken from page 2 of the active exchange report. Correct?
That's right. Correct.
And it is also correct, isn't it, that that does not equate to the 30-minute drive time?
That is correct.
Because the 30-minute drive time can be seen on page 6 of the active exchange report.
That is correct.
Correct?
Correct.
And it's clear from just looking at that rather better plan, which is coloured, that the catchment area extends well beyond the I think it's the M62, is it the M62? To the north, coming in from the Humber. That's right,
Sorry,
isn't it?
Mr. Village, was that a question for me?
Yeah, that's what
We-
I should say. It's right that, when I say it's right that, it's is pregnant with a question. So let me put it again. It's right that the catchment area extends on your map 1.1 to beyond the M62 motorway, isn't it?
The M62 motorway, yes, it is correct, yes.
Yeah, okay. In fact, the inspector seems to have disappeared.
You're still on my screen.
Yeah, looking at the inspectors. Oh, I think she's back now. Madam, you disappeared for a moment. I don't know whether that was intentional to go and get a cup of coffee or something and gone again.
No, I've been here all the time. Don't worry.
You're consistently on my screen, Mum, for the record.
I think it's, the background I have on, sometimes my head disappears from the screen, but I am actually still there. So.
No, I think you literally just completely went. So, anyway, as long as you were able to hear, you haven't missed anything, I think, so far. So going back then to this figure 1.1, I mean that equates, that shape. Now Mr. Hodgson seems to have disappeared, but I think he's probably listening.
I'm here. Mr. Village, if you pin me to your screen, then I won't disappear when I don't talk. So if you right click on my head and then pin me, then I will stay no matter what.
I've lost the inspector.
If you do the same action with the inspector, she can't disappear either.
Well, she has disappeared from my screen.
I've been here all the time. I think I keep losing Mr. Village and Mr. Hodgson. It appears only one of you can appear on the screen at the same time. I can still hear you, so there's not a problem there. So I suggest we continue.
Okay, well, I've got both of you now back on the screen, so I've got the inspector back on the screen now, and I have, as Mr. Hodgson suggested, pinned you both. Right, that area roughly equates to a 45-minute drive time, doesn't it?
What equates to a 45-minute drive time, please, Mr. Village?
The area identified on map 1.1.
Well, no, it doesn't. It's an MDC map 1.1. It's a minimum distance catchment, which means it's not restricted. It's just the minimum distance when all other crematoria are factored in. So it's not based on drive time.
I know it's not based on drive time, but I'm looking what in actual fact it represents. And the reason I say that is because if one turns to Mr. Best's evidence.
What page would you like to turn up?
You will see what the 45-minute area is, and I think if you go to, for example, figure 10.1 on page 57, or yeah, go to 10.1 on page 57,
I have that.
There you see what in fact represents a 45-minute drive time, and it pretty much resembles the same shape and area which your map 1.1 represents, doesn't it?
It's very hard to correlate those two things, because the only way that you could do it with any knowledge or accuracy would be as if Mr. Best then told us what sits within those catchment areas, and then use the tables to be able to identify it. Doing maps compared is very difficult, but to be clear, map 1.1 is at minimum distance catchment to the same order as Mr. Best's 10.2a, where he uses an actual catchment area which is equivalent to my minimum distance catchment. So if you want to do direct comparison, those two do that.
Well, that's a rather interesting point that you make, because in fact if you turn to figure 10.2a of Mr. Best's evidence, that extends even further north beyond the 45-minute drive time, doesn't it?
In the case of Mr. Best's 10.2a, yes, it does.
And all I was putting to you, Mr. Hodgson, maybe that you don't really want to help me or can't help me, but I was simply putting to you that in very rough terms, the area which we've demonstrated in figure 1.1, map 1.1, equates in general terms to a 45-minute drive time, according to Mr. Best.
Well, it doesn't, respectfully, Mr. Village. Map 1.1 is a minimum distance catchment, which is calculating the minimum distance catchment. It's not doing anything in terms of 30, 45 or any other drive time. If you want to do a direct comparison, do it with 10.2a of Mr. Best proof, where he does exactly the same exercise as map 1.1. Yeah.
And if we go back to your paragraph 3, in particular 3.3, the implication actually is that
just give me 1 moment, sorry. I'm moving around documents here. 3.3, did you say, sir?
Yeah, this is your proof of evidence. The implication is that what you've taken is a 30-minute drive time.
There is no implication in that 3.3 that I've taken a 30-minute drive time. I'm just making a general comment about the 30-minute drive time. There's no implication in my evidence that suggests otherwise. It's completely clear that it's a minimum distance catchment, which is very much the one thing that all the parties agree on is a fair measure of understanding catchment areas.
Yeah, I mean, you don't, in fact, go explain what the minimum distance catchment is, do you, in those paragraphs? I mean, it starts with, in 3.1, that the accepted basis for assessing quantitative need is that the public will rarely travel further than they need to get to their nearest crematorium. Obvious exceptions to that, you say. You then say most quantitative assessments are based on GIS systems which calculate minimum distance drive times. This essentially means that based on the existing road network, it's able to calculate the population that will be located nearer to the proposed site than any other existing crematorium in the country. And then you say there are no industry standard travel times for crematoria access. However, previous appeal decisions have applied a 30-minute drive time catchment as a rule of thumb. And then you explain how that works. And you say the results of such an analysis will enable one to establish the number of people who currently live over 30 minutes away from their nearest crematorium, but within 30 minutes of the proposed site. So without more, there isn't in fact any explanation as to what an MDC is, and in terms of drive times, the implication is, because you don't mention any other drive times, that it's 30 minutes.
I don't agree with that, Mr. Village. That's your implication. I make it very clear that the minimum distance catchment is what's used in 3.5, which incidentally I've just noticed is a continuation. It should starts above the table and ends below the table. And I say that quantitative need is usually defined by assessing the minimum distance catchment. Now, in paragraph 3.2, the MDC is essentially the existing road network that shows the amount of population that's closer to the site than any other crematorium in the country. That is the MDC, and that is agreeable, seemingly, by all parties as a fair way of assessing a quantitative catchment area, the difference being the way in which we're going about it. But I don't see that there's disagreement between us on the MDC as a principle. The appellant calls it an NCA, but it's essentially the same thing.
Okay, well, let's just move this forward, because I mean, I'm trying to understand why there are differences between the evidence of you and Mr. Best and Mr. Mitchell. Turn to Mr. Mitchell's need statement, if you would, please.
Did you say his need statement or his
need assessment?
All right, I haven't got that printed. Is it in a core document?
It is a core document, and someone's going to tell me what the core document number is. Hang on a second, I'll probably do that myself.
C1, I think, Mr. Village.
Thank you very much. C1.
Can I just be clear? Is that the new analysis of existing evidence on need that was?
No, that's not in the core documents as far as I know. No, it's C1.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Village. My documents on the council's website are not firing up at all. I'm terribly sorry. They're not firing up at all. They're going. It's happened to me last week as well.
So you didn't do what the inspector advised might be a good idea, to download them.
Well, all of them? No, I'm afraid I did not. Do you want to? I mean, I'm happy if you want to quote it to me, but for some reason right now I won't be able to have it in front of me. Last time this happened, the way of doing it was to restart the machine, I'm afraid.
Well, I think it might be helpful if you did that, because we do need to look at this document.
Okay. Ma'am, would that be acceptable if I log off and then restart and come back so that I can download it, or what would you like me to do?
I think if Mr. Village,
or maybe someone could send me the document.
If Mr. Village is going to be referring to the document a lot, then yes, I think you need to have access to it. Sure. It may be quicker for somebody to email it to you.
Send me the document. Yeah, that would be quicker, definitely. Someone could do that. Don't know if a member of my team could do that. So that's Mr. Mitchell's need document that went in with the planning application, I see.
Yes, core document reference C1.
C1. Could a member of my team send me an email on that, if possible? Mr. Mitchell could do that. That would be great. Could I just ask Mr. Mitchell to confirm that he sent this to me, please? Okay.
Yes, I have just sent that over.
Thank you very much.
I think Mr. Mitchell's just beat me to it. I've just sent a copy over as well as a PDF file.
Is it quite large? Because it hasn't arrived as yet.
It's 12 megabytes.
Right.
I've just heard mine ping as though it's been sent.
Thank you. I have the document. Apologies, Ma'am. Apologies, Mr. Village. I have it now, Mr. Village. Where would you like me to turn up?
8.92, Mr. Hodgson.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. .92.
Yeah.
My section 8 ends at 8.17.
I think you've been sent his proof. This is the need assessment, C1.
For crying out loud, I have been sent his proof. Mr. Mitchell, please can you send me his need assessment?
Mr. Hodgson, if you've received an email from me, it's a completely blank email. I assure my learned friend that it's completely blank. The only attachment is document C1.
I haven't got it, I'm afraid. Mr. Barrett's just come in. Okay, I've got it now. And it's 8.92. Thank you for being patient, Mr. Village. 8.92. I have it in front of me.
Right, so you have that in front of you, and you can see that for Barnby Dun, the population identified within a constrained 30-minute drive time for Barnby Dun is 98,049.
Yes, I see that.
Compared with for Brodsworth 136,933, so almost 137,000. Yeah.
Yes, I see that.
And just to give the inspector an idea as to how that changes if you take a minimum drive time catchment area, one can turn to your table 3.1 on page 8 of your evidence.
I have that.
And this is a minimum drive time catchment area of showing a population of 135,954. Correct?
For Barnby Dun.
For Barnby Dun, yes?
Yes, yes, I have that.
Apologies, Mr. Village. Which reference in Mr. Hodgson's?
Table 3.1, Madam, page 8.
Thank you. You identify the population for Brodsworth based on an MDC of which is an MDC, as we know, extends beyond the 30-minute drive time, but the population for Brodsworth you identify as 120,670. That's in table, the table at paragraph 3.7, correct?
Correct.
Which compares with the figure given by Mr. Mitchell, based on a constrained 30-minute drive time of 136,000.
I see that. Correct.
Yeah. So, okay. Now, it's quite clear, therefore, that you, Mr. Mitchell, you and Mr. Mitchell, who are both devotees, if I can put it like that, without being unkind, of looking at population areas, are both working from different figures and looking at this in a different way. That's self-evident, isn't it, from the figures we've just been looking at?
I think the only thing that separates Mr. Mitchell and the appellant and I is on the methodology that goes into the software that we use. And as I've said all along, we have demonstrated the speeds that are used in that position in Appendix 1 of my Appendix 1 to the Active Exchange Report, which are the same speeds that we've used in every single appeal, every single planning application when we've sat in the appellant's shoes as the developer and operator. And therefore, I can't comment on Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Best's position on the speeds that they used in their assessments. But what I can say is that normally there is a 98% similarity between ArcGIS and Map Professional, which is the system that I use. So I don't know, because I can't, there's nothing in their evidence that says what speeds are used. But all I can say, Mr. Village, is that the figures that are put in my proof are there with a undertow of exactly what created them, and they're the same as I've always used and we've always used. So I can't comment why those figures are different outside of the other two, but all I can say is the ones that I've put forward are definitely accurate on the basis of the speeds used.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a Mr. Best deals with the drive time surveys in his rebuttal evidence, which you haven't sought to criticise in your evidence in chief or otherwise, and he will speak to those in due course. And clearly there are different platforms which can be used for assessing these things, but there must be more to it simply than drive times, because there are some quite wide disparities in population numbers. That's what I'm really getting at, between you and Mr. Mitchell, for example.
Mr. Village, I would outline that Mr. Best in his rebuttal proof quotes actual desktop providers of journey times rather than his own GIS platform. He quotes Waze, he quotes the AA, he quotes Google. These are all methods of far less sophistication than the GIS platform that would have created his catchment area. So in his rebuttal proof, he does nothing to give more information about what's generated those figures at all, I'm afraid.
No, what he does is he explains that the times that he's used are entirely consistent with other recognised journey time applications. And that's the purpose of why he did that, in order to demonstrate that what he did was, what his journey times are consistent and not in any way over or under cooking the actuality. Well,
what would have been much more helpful actually is to see the speeds that he plugged into his manual entry point of his GIS system, because that's what we don't have, I'm afraid.
Well, what he explained is that he took 60% of the 30 miles an hour, and which is the appropriate approach.
It isn't the appropriate approach. The ArcGIS and MapInfo Pro have to have speeds inserted into them when they generate catchment areas. I have appended mine. They are the same as we've always used. There is no evidence provided by Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Best that shows the same manual inputting that they should have put in to their GIS system. So I've been completely unable to reconcile those positions.
You made that criticism on Friday. Did you at any stage think to ask Mr. Best for his workings?
No, Mr. Village. I in the same way as I wouldn't expect him to ask me, I expect him to present evidence that he can rely on, and he hasn't presented that evidence to this inquiry.
It is his evidence as an expert, which he presents to the inquiry. And if you were wanting to see any further information which supported it, you could have asked to see it, couldn't you?
I absolutely could have done, and I would have asked equally for Mr. Best to present that evidence as clear definition of why his GIS system says what it does. But there is no such evidence provided. It's very normal to actually provide that evidence, but Mr. Best chose not to.
Well, he told you what the final results were, and if you wanted to challenge it, you could have asked it. Now, if you turn to his comparisons of trade diversion, what Mr. Best does is seek to compare the respective positions of the parties, doesn't he?
Would you mind repeating that question, Mr. Village? I lost you very briefly when you were halfway through.
Yes, certainly. If you turn to his rebuttal.
His rebuttal, yes.
Yeah.
Hang on a sec. Let me just turn that up. Thank you. I have his rebuttal. Which section would you like me to refer to?
As I said, and for the third time, section 3.
Section 3. Yep.
And table 3.1. What he does is he compares the diversion figures that you provide with those provided by Mr. Mitchell, doesn't he?
He attempts to, Mr. Village, but he actually quotes them wrongly. But yes.
Oh, he quotes them wrongly, does he?
He does, yeah. Unfortunately, in 3.1.
Okay. Well, do you want to explain how he quotes them wrongly?
Well, for example,
that's not evidence that you've given hitherto, but do explain.
The reason I haven't is that I don't think it materially changes the position. But actually, if you look, for example, at Hodgson 5, he quotes 405 for Rose Hill, for example. And then if you turn up
5.
it says 405 is the diversion between Rose Hill to Brodsworth.
Just give me a moment. I'm just turning up your table 3.5, which unfortunately you don't number your tables, do you? I don't think.
I do.
Some of them you do. Some of them don't.
Table 3.5. Page 10 of my proof.
Okay. Sorry, the reason I was misled is because you have a table 3.2 on page 9, and then it goes straight to table 3.5 on page 10.
Well, that's
wrong with the.
That is, it is labelled.
So right, table 3.5, correct.
You can see that the actual diversion to Brodsworth is 458, not 405. You'll see then that the diversion to Barnsley is 99, not 87. You'll then see that the diversion to Rotherham is 73, not 64. You'll see then to Pontefract the diversion is 196, not 173. And you'll then see that the Barnby Dun is 148, not 131. And the total is 975, not 860. So, as I said, I haven't raised it because it's not a material difference. It doesn't create a big problem, but he has actually, in fact, quoted them wrongly.
Okay, just give me a second to catch up with you on that. So just give me those figures again, would you, if you wouldn't mind?
Not at all. So Rose Hill, he quotes 405. I actually show 458.
Yeah.
Barnsley, Mr. Best quotes 87. The table quotes 99. Got that one?
Yep, thank you.
Rotherham, Mr. Best quotes 64. The table quotes 73. Pontefract, Mr. Best quotes 173. Table quotes 196. And Barnby Dun, Mr. Best quotes 131. We actually have 148, and the total therefore is adjusted from 860 to 975.
Thank you very much. Just give me a moment, if you would, please. Thank you very much. Well, we'll look at that. Take that away, Mr. Hodgson. Thank you very much. But I think even if we go then to the diversions, have you checked that against the percentage on the diversions?
Yes, the percentages are correct.
Oh, the percentages are correct, are they?
Correct.
Oh, I see why you say it doesn't make any difference.
Hence why I didn't raise it, Mr. Village.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, it really doesn't make any difference because, I mean, the only issue here is what the diversions are. And
well, respectfully, I would disagree with that, by the way. I don't think it's all about the diversions percentages. I think that the real numbers are important, but there we are. Okay.
Well, thank you, but that's helpful. So the diversions don't change, and what we see then is that you and Mr. Mitchell have quite a considerably different view of the world in relation to Rose Hill in terms of the effect of Brodsworth. I mean, you're almost up at 50%, and he's at a third. Barnsley, you're on the same page. Rotherham it's about 3% difference. Pontefract there's a 5% difference, and Barnby Dun there's a 4% difference. That's right, isn't it?
That's
so the main issue in relation to the differences between you and Mr. Mitchell relate to Rose Hill. Thank you very much. And then at the next table, 3.3 in the rebuttal deals with the differences between you and Mr. Best.
yes.
And again, there is a considerable difference between you and Mr. Best in relation to Rose Hill, and the other differences. Barnby Dun is quite a difference as well, isn't there? I think 8%. And 5% for Barnsley. Okay, and then the differences between Mr. Best and Mr. Mitchell are set out in table 7.5. So if you then go on to
Sorry, Mr. Village, 7.5.
Did you mean 3.5?
3.5, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and that's the diversion to Brodsworth, the differences between Mr. Best and Mr. Mitchell, which are very much, I mean, those differences are very much less marked than the differences between you and Mr. Mitchell and you and Mr. Best, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, that's very fair. Thank you very much. And so in that respect, you're the outlier here, aren't you?
Well, I'm the only one to use a different software to them. I'm also the only one to present what actual speeds have been inputted into said system, which I confirm once again are the same speeds that we use when we're promoting our own crematoria. Well, so it would be very helpful if either party, to be able to understand the differences, did that. I think that all I can say with total assurance, Ma'am, is that what we have put forward is totally consistent with what we've always put forward for every appeal that we've appeared at, every planning application that we've put in. So that's all I can say on the subject. I can't comment on the differences because outside of the fact that it's a different software, although it should, as I say, equate to 98% of the same position, it's very difficult to be able to reconcile those two things.
Well, Mr. Hodgson, I regret to say that what you've just said is not right, because in fact the position is that you have adopted an inconsistent approach in this case, in the case you're now presenting, to the case that you presented on your very own planning application. And over the break, which will be coming up shortly, I'm going to send round the needs statement that you submitted on behalf of Memoria in relation to your own planning application at Barnby Dun, in light of what you've just asserted.
Fine. If you show, you won't be able to show any differences in speeds, that's for certain. Well,
I will go further than that and show some considerable differences in the way you've approached this and the inconsistencies you've just identified. But let's just, I won't come on to that right now, and I'm going to send it round over the break so that we don't lose any time. I just want to identify some other differences between you and, for example, Mr. Best. The first relates to the direct cremations rate, and it's right that you use a figure of 20%, don't you?
In 2033, yes.
And you adopt a, and this is, I think, dealt with in your evidence, just so that the inspector's got a note.
If you look at my rebuttal proof,
5.8.
well, it's there, and also in my rebuttal proof, I explain the differences between us, which actually is clarified particularly in paragraphs 2.4 to 2.14, where we talk specifically about the direct cremation rate.
Yeah, the direct cremation rate that you've taken for 2034 is 20, or 2033, I should say, is 20%.
Correct.
And that's because Memoria has experienced a DC rate across its operational crematoria of 19% in 2018, 21% in 2019, 25% in 2020, and 28% in 2021. Now, in relation to 2020 and 2021, Mr. Hodgson, do you, in all honesty and fairness, consider it as appropriate to take any account of the cremation, of the direct cremation rates in relation to those years?
I do, Mr. Village, and I do, Mum, because direct cremation, I accept Mr. Village's overriding point will be that from a pandemic perspective, because of the dangers of leaving one's home, the limited number of attendees that were on restrictions for some part of 2020 and some part of 2021, about 7 to 8 months in 2020 and about 4 months to 5 months, sorry, a bit more, 6 months in 2021. Therefore, the direct cremation rate will be materially higher. What is also happening, though, alongside the pandemic, is that the level of direct cremations is increasing regardless, because suddenly people are waking up to the flexibility that it gives people. And as I said, the appellants were later coming into this market. I think they came in 2018. We started in 2016. But it is a significant growth area, which is growing rapidly year on year. So to answer the point, Mr. Village, I'm not seeking, as you can see, to say that the current rate is 20%. What I am seeking to say is that over the next 13 years, I believe 20% represents a very conservative measure when you bear in mind that even today, as we sit here, our rate is at 28% year to date.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer, Mr. Hodgson. But the fact is that, first of all, Memoria has, as part of its business model, a direct cremation service, doesn't it? It's a significant part of your business model.
So does the appellant, I might add.
Well, no, Mr. That is, it's not nearly the same as yours, and Mr. Lathby will deal with that in his evidence in due course. But if we turn to Mr. Best's evidence, please, at 9.10, I think you will agree, won't you, that the actual figures for direct cremations recorded in the directory of crematoria in 2018, it is that the main 4 crematoria collectively undertook 338 direct cremations, which is 3.92% of the total cremations undertaken. That's right. As a matter of fact, yes. Correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Correct.
And indeed, Mr. Mitchell, in his evidence, I think at paragraph 7.25, notes that data published by the Cremation Society of Great Britain indicates that in 2018, 3.1% were direct cremations, and this figure rose to 5.3% in 2019 and 10.1% in 2020. Not all crematoria report direct cremations separately on their annual survey return. So these figures understate the level of demand.
I agree.
Well, you have against those 3 years, 2018, 2019, 2020, effectively gone from 3.92% to a figure of 20%.
11.52, Mr. Village. Sorry to correct you. 11.52. 20% is in 2033.
I was about to say 2033 if you hadn't interrupted me.
I'm very
sorry. Please allow me to finish the question, Mr. Hodgson. You have gone, I'm going to put it again, I'll start again, and I'm sorry that we waste time in this way. 3.9%. You've gone from 3.9% in 2019 to 23. Mr. Hodgson, should we just establish some ground rules? Because if you want to respond in due course, you'll have every opportunity, okay?
I'm very sorry. You quoted back the wrong figure.
You'll have every opportunity. But I'm going to put the question again, and please don't interrupt me. 3.9% in 2019, which is the figure which is taken from the directory, and you've gone from that figure, 3.9% in 2019, to 20% in 2033. And you have done so based upon your understanding or an analysis which includes 2 years of a once-in-a-century pandemic, haven't you?
Okay, so to respond to your question, and apologies for interrupting you, it was wrong, many apologies, but you just quoted 3.92% in 2019. If you turn up 9.10 of the paragraph you just took me to, it's 3.92% in 2018, not 2019. And in 2018, direct cremation barely existed in this country. It was unheard of. Most crematoria didn't provide it. Over the course of the last 3 years, it has been introduced. Now, I understand this is a very inconvenient truth for people that are looking to prove capacity issues at crematoria. But the fact remains is that direct cremation is growing, and it is growing significantly. We took an 11.52% number for looking at things in the current day, and regardless of the growth that we are seeing every single year over the course of 2019, 2020, 2021, this site will not open until 2023 at the earliest. So we took, though, again, conservatively, the level of direct cremations that were reported in 2020, which is 11.52% in England for the crematoria that report direct cremation. That, for us, is the number that we've used looking at the current day. We've then taken a 20% rate in 2033, set against the 14% or 11% actually after the hybrid cremations were reduced by Mr. Best. So there is a difference there, but I find it very difficult to understand why the appellant, who is placing so much emphasis on promoting this service, would only believe that in 13 years' time, that would only equate to 11%. It is our view that direct cremation is growing. It is growing across the country, and actually next year and the year after, you won't have the disparity that Mr. Mitchell describes about a certain number of crematoria that don't even currently report it. Everyone will report it, and that rate will continue to go up. Where it goes, none of us know. I believe that 20% represents a conservative estimate for 13 years' time, given the level of effort that all main parties are putting into this particular offering, including the appellant through their Simplicity brand and including Westerly through their new distinct cremation brand. These parties are spending millions of pounds as we speak on advertising for this very service. I don't think they would do that if they thought it was going to end up in 13 years' time as only 11% of their business.
Well, your figure of 20% is a stab in the dark in relation to the industry, isn't it?
It is a conservative estimate based on the current trends that sit before this inquiry.
Trends which relate two of the 3 years which relate to the worst pandemic that has occurred in a century.
I don't believe that there's a direct correlation between the growth of direct cremation and the pandemic.
Well, and that, if I may say so, Mr. Hodgson, is palpable nonsense. And it's palpable nonsense because many people were simply unable to attend or were frightened to attend cremations and gather with other people during that time. And they were discouraged from attending. And it is undoubtedly the case that there were many, many more direct cremations during that time because of the pandemic and the restrictions imposed by government. That's right.
I don't agree, Mr. Village, and I think the reason I don't is based on the actual evidence. Based on the evidence before this inquiry, it still ended up with 90%, just under 89% of services still attending services. So if it's having such a palpable impact, as you suggest, it would have been far higher.
No, palpable nonsense, I said.
Oh, okay.
I'm
sorry, what I said was nonsense.
Yeah, Mr. Hodgson, to be honest, I would be very surprised if you agree with any of the propositions I put forward to you. I mean, clearly you have very trenchant and immovable views on these things, but I have to put these things, you understand, to you in order to respond. Madam, that might be a convenient moment as I go on to the next point in a few moments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Village. We shall adjourn the inquiry until 11:15. Thank you. Is that acceptable?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. See you back 11:15. Welcome back, everyone. It's 11:15 and the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Village, would you like to recommence cross-examination, Mr. Hodgson? Do we have Mr. Village?
Couldn't find my mouse. Thank you. We've sent over the report, the need assessment submitted, Mr. Hodgson, with your own planning application, haven't we?
Yes, I have received it. Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Mr. Village, I haven't received that yet. Was it sent to the case officer?
Apparently it was, yes, ma'am.
Just bear with me a moment. Just to clarify, it's not in the core documents, is it?
No, it isn't, ma'am.
Ma'am, I've just seen on the email that I was sent, it's been added to core document E16. I would check, but as you know, I can't seem to get on there. But E16, according to Mr. Land's email, the appellant.
It's in hand, it's being sent. So do you just want to carry on, Mr. Village, rather than lose time?
Yeah, I mean, there may be it may be that you don't even have to be troubled to look at the document, depending on the answers that Mr. Hodgson gives. But Mr. Hodgson, this document submitted with your planning application in July 2019.
Yeah.
There is no mention at all of direct cremations, is there?
No, Mr. Village, there's not in this section of the need assessment, no.
No. And that's because you didn't consider that direct cremations would form any material part in the assessment of this of your crematorium in an assessment at 2033.
Well,
That's
Mr.
right.
Village, what you know, the assessment actually is not right, but the position here is that this was submitted with the planning application to show the quantitative catchment area. It makes no attempt in this section to look at capacity. That was done in the design and access statement. So,
okay. So there was no mention in the design and access statement, which we can get, of direct cremations either.
no, there wasn't. I agree with you. There wasn't.
Okay. So direct cremations not mentioned at all, notwithstanding that they have formed part of your core business since 2016.
Correct.
And do you still maintain that your approach is consistent with your previous applications?
Yes, I do, because I'm making no attempts in my need assessment to try and define capacity in the same way as the appellant is. What the appellant is trying to do is effectively show that services are overwhelmed in the vicinity of the appeal site. I didn't attempt to do that in my planning application. So I wasn't looking at the direct cremation rate because I wasn't relying on the capacity evidence. What your client is doing is relying on the capacity evidence on the basis that their argument is these sites are so overrun, you need to grant another planning consent for another crematorium, and therefore they present capacity evidence, which direct cremation is very relevant to, because we've all agreed between the parties that direct cremation should be subtracted from any capacity evidence.
Okay, that's your explanation, is it?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I don't think you need to be too troubled, madam, in light of the answers, to read that document in any detail, or the design and access statements, given the agreement that direct cremations are not dealt with in either. Right, thank you very much. Now, the practical capacity, that is dealt with by you. Oh, well, can we deal with the 85% cremation rate, please?
Sure.
That 85% cremation rate is represents, first of all, is based upon what is now an 80% cremation rate.
Yes.
As existing.
Correct.
And by contrast to the approach that you urge on the inspector to take a leap of faith based on your own assertion and 3 years of 3 years worth of data for direct cremations, where it goes up from 3.9% in 2018 to some 20% in 2033. You say there shouldn't be any increase in the cremation rate from 80 to 85%, as suggested and encouraged by Mr. Best, and indeed agreed now by Mr. Mitchell.
Yeah.
And then notwithstanding that the graph hasn't plateaued and is still inexorably rising. So you see clearly the inconsistency in your approach there, don't you?
Well, I don't, because they're two completely different things, but I'm more than happy to articulate why I take the view. Mum, I've given a sort of brief look at my evidence and my rebuttal proof where I talk about religion and the fact that there is a clear maximum that the cremation rate can never go to on the basis of choice within religion being limited to burial in the case of all Muslims, and preferred in the case of all the Jewish and Roman Catholic communities. But I actually believe that the greater position, or the greater emphasis of my position on the 80% rate, is because I'm nervous about environmental impact. I always have been in recent times. I think we will all agree in this inquiry, you can't turn on your television at the moment before hearing something about carbon footprint, and cremation is not a performer from a carbon footprint perspective. And as we move into this next phase of trying to become carbon neutral, it is my belief that we will see a move away from cremation, given that 99% of the country that provide cremators do so with a gas cremator, which is not a good performer from a carbon emissions perspective. Now, at the moment, there is no impact considered for that at all. And it's impossible for us to know what that's going to be. The way to remedy it is to look at environmentally friendly options, of which there are several being proposed that are not confirmed. And there is from green burial all the way through to electric cremation, permission, resumation, ecolation, to name a few. Now, the point I'm making here is that I make no attempt to reduce the rate, because I have no way of knowing how that is going to reduce by based on environmental considerations over the next stretch of time. But what I do say is that it's very difficult to see it going up beyond the 80% that it has now reached, because I believe that the expense of making the carbon footprint improvements, which we've started as a company, having had an electric cremator in Oxfordshire last year, the first in the country, and ordering one for the Barnby Dun facility that's now starting construction. We have the funds to do that, but we must remember that 191 of the 311 current crematoria are local council, and where making those sort of investments to become carbon neutral will become difficult. So there might well be some choppy waters ahead for that. I don't seek to reduce it in any of my assessments, because that would be inconsistent with what I've done in our own planning applications, but I do not believe that it will go above the 80% figure stated.
The explanation that you have just given is not to be found in any of your evidence to date, Mr. Hodgson, is it?
Yes, it is actually, Mr. I'll turn it up for you. Turn to my rebuttal proof, please.
2.3.
2.3. You see that within there, I talk about the movement to Muslims. I talk about everything I've just said.
Yeah, the religion points, your Catholic and Jewish, strong reference to Barbarian, Sikh and Hindu. The environmental issues that you point, that's my point. That is not mentioned.
2.2, Mr. Village. Given some alternatives to cremation which are increasing in popularity, green burials as well as other completely new alternatives, i.e. resumation, we don't think the cremation rate will increase beyond its 80%. Resumation and green burials are environmentally friendly opportunities.
You do not.
If I could finish, if you take what I had just said in the round, you would seek to ask me to reduce that cremation rate. So I've put it in a fair and balanced way in 2.2.
Mr. Hodgson, if that's the way you wish your evidence to be judged, I'm not going to dissuade you from giving answers like that.
That's fine.
If you're suggesting, in all fairness, that you have identified the environmental effects of of crematoria and dealing with issues of going to carbon neutral and the issues of gas and so on and so forth, all of which you gave in your very long answer, which I didn't interrupt. If that's the way you wish your evidence to be construed, I will make submissions about it. There is nothing in there, though, in all fairness. And Mr. Hodgson, in all truth, about environmental considerations, it's not even mentioned, is it?
I say in 2.2, and I'm happy to quote it, given some alternatives to cremation which are increasing in popularities, in brackets, green burials, as well as other completely new alternatives, in brackets, resumation, we don't think that the cremation rate will increase beyond 80%. If it pleases you, Mr. Village, you can take 2.2 as my evidence on the point.
It neither pleases me nor displeases me, Mr. Hodgson. I simply have to ask the questions which cry out for an explanation. And it's a shame that we haven't had a response of an adequate response on that. Never mind, I'll move on. Mr. Hodgson, the 80% practical capacity point, please.
Would you like me to turn up anything in particular?
Would you turn, please, to paragraph 5.16?
Which document, please, Mr. Village?
That's your proof of evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Here, you say, looking, and this is referable back to the table up the page on page 17, looking at the 2020 and 2033 capacity tables above, it's fair to say that the appellant is correct in suggesting that the scheme at Barnby Dun will not divert significant services away from Barnsley, Rotherham or Pontefract. As such, whilst these figures demonstrate that the 3 crematoria are not operating significantly over capacity, it's true that they're all currently trading over 80% in terms of core service availability, both for peak and non-peak months. However, the key question is whether the appeal site is in the right location to significantly reduce the capacity pressure at any of these 3 crematoria. Now, in the context of the way you put it, the key question is whether the appeal site is in the right location to significantly reduce this capacity pressure. The capacity pressure is the fact that they're currently trading over 80%, isn't it?
Correct.
And that 80% figure is a figure which has already been accepted by the Secretary of State in the Wergs and Essington appeals, isn't it?
Correct, it has.
Are you departing from the use of that 80% figure as a measure of the threshold for determining whether crematoria are, or there is a qualitative deficiency?
Well, I am, insofar as the 80% figure has a number of different measures that you can get to said 80%. The appellant and Memorial are actually more aligned on that point, whereas more aggressive competitors such as Westerly, Horizon have got an even more aggressive view on the 80%. And actually that threshold becomes lower in terms of the cremations that are needed as a result. So my view is that 80% is a guide, but equally it is not that it's acceptable at 79% and it's not acceptable at 81. When a measure can actually give answers in up to half of the crematoria in this country being over 80%. So where I disagree with the appellant is that I don't say, unless they've got testimony from other crematoria that says it, that actually if you are over 80%, you naturally are having a poor level of qualitative service. I don't accept that point. So that's where we differ on the 80%.
I think that in fact the point of difference is rather narrower than you suggest, Mr. Hodgson. It's not to say that it's impossible to provide a qualitative service over 80%. The point is whether or not it becomes difficult to provide to offer a cremation service that provides an acceptable qualitative standard. And the answer to that is that clearly it does become difficult after 80% as a threshold figure, doesn't it?
It does become more difficult. I agree on that point, absolutely. Yeah. But I would qualify it by saying that using that measure, it doesn't have a top level of 100%. Using that measure, there are crematoria that can perform at 150, 160, 200% of practical capacity. So they seem to be still able to operate. So it's the percentage relative to the 100 that I take issue with.
No, the issue is not whether or not they can operate above 80% or 100% or, as you said, 200%. That is not the issue here. The issue relates to qualitative provision, and all I'm putting to you is that above 80%, and I think you've agreed to it actually in what you've just said, it makes it more difficult to offer a cremation service that provides an acceptable quantitative standard.
Qualitative standard, yes. I mean, qualitative standard. I think it's a moot point between us, because ultimately the evidence put forward by Mr. Best suggests that if you are over 80%, you can't provide a qualitative, decent level of quality service. I am not saying that. I agree with your position that it becomes more difficult to do so.
Okay. Well, would you turn then to the statement of common ground on need, please?
Yeah, sure.
Which you have signed. Paragraph 3.7.
Just 1 second, Mr. Village. I actually have to get this one up. It's not up in front of me. Paragraph 3.7. Yes.
Yeah. And you'll see that one of the issues, the matters of dispute,
Yep.
further need matters disputed by the Rule 6 party only, whether a crematorium operating above 80% of its practical capacity makes it difficult to offer a cremation service that provides an acceptable qualitative standard.
Yes, I don't agree with that statement.
Oh, no, you just have.
No, well, I haven't. No,
you just have assented to that very statement, and I
That's
put
not true. It's not true.
I am going to finish the question. I put it to you in precisely the terms set out there. In fact, I read it from that page. I got the word qualitative wrong, and you corrected me to say qualitative. And you said, yes, I agree with you in the way you put it. It's Mr. Best who I don't agree with, because he says it's impossible to ... And we can all read this, fortunately, due to
right here.
wonderful, due to the fact that we've got YouTube in due course. We can look back on what you said in terms. You agreed and you assented to the proposition I put to you.
Mr. Best, if I might respond, where you put here, I'll read exactly what the 3.7 says. Whether a crematorium operating above 80% of its practical capacity makes it difficult to offer a cremation service that provides an acceptable qualitative standard. And it's the idea of acceptable that I don't agree with.
Well, I read that word. I read the statement to you, and you said you accepted that. I mean, Mr. Hodgson, I mean, it's perfectly apparent, and I'm so long in the tooth that, frankly, I used to give witnesses a second or third chance, and frankly, I'm too tired to do that now in my career, and I'm just going to move on because the inspector wants to cut through this. She can look at your answer in due course. It's wonderful that we have YouTube. I wish we had that before. Thank you very much. That's all I'm going to ask you about that question. We've got your answer. Good. And then, Mr. Hodgson, rebalancing. Now, I can understand, and I'm not going to take advantage, that as a non-planner, you may have some difficulty in understanding this. But I'm going to do so. I'm going to put the point in terms of retail impact. Okay. And I think you used to be involved in the retail sector. Was it the automotive sector? You sold cars?
I'd never sold cars, I'm afraid.
Oh, I thought you acted. I thought in your past you were employed by Audi.
I was a strategic analyst for their top company. Never got to sell the cars, unfortunately.
Oh, right. Okay. So, but let me just look at it, Mr. Hodgson, as though it's a shopping exercise. And what happens is that you have a Sainsbury's, for example, and it's over trading its socks off. There are long queues at the checkouts, so on and so forth. And an Aldi opens down the road. And what you tend to find is that suddenly there are no longer those long queues at the checkout at Sainsbury because people have got a choice and they go down to Aldi. And then a Tesco opens up a few doors down from that. And people say, oh, actually, I'm not that keen on Aldi. I'll go to Tesco as well instead. And so what you then have is you have three stores operating within the same market and overlapping catchment areas. And then what happens is that as Tesco becomes more and more popular, people start to drift back to Sainsbury's, because actually the queues aren't so bad at Sainsbury's after all. And a few people will stay with Aldi, and a few people from Tesco will say, well, I'll go and shop at Tesco and Aldi. So there is effectively a fluctuation in how trade over time develops. That's part and parcel of the rebalancing exercise. And all I'm interested from your perspective, and I appreciate, Mr. Hodgson, that you're not a planner, is that first of all, it's not a concept that you're familiar with in a planning sense, and indeed it's not the concept that you've applied yourself in any of your previous applications, is it?
Oh, it is, but not using the methodology that you put forward. And I would say, Mr. Village, for your very kind supermarket analogy, I have personally been involved with opening 11 new Victoria over the last 10 years across different sections of this country, where I have seen how the actual position for crematoria materialise. So I don't need to think too much about a shopping analogy when I've actually opened crematoria, which is effectively what we're looking to accurately do here. We do rebalancing based on new drafted MDCs. What I now know you do, thanks to paragraph 35 of your closing at works, is you take 100% of that position, and then you take on another 50% of anything in a 12.9 minute drive time outside of that position. And I believe that the way in which you conduct your rebalancing, or the appellant conducts their rebalancing, is not consistent with anything that I have seen in opening 11 crematoria across this country. And I know that because we monitor our performance set against those MDCs, and we are able to see as a result how and which those are actually penetrating their markets in the place that they open. And the position that you put out, or the appellant puts out, in terms of rebalancing, in my opinion, is flawed for this case.
Your characterization of what has been done in this case by Mr. Best is inaccurate, but I don't need to ask you about that. I'm only interested in your evidence, and okay. So far as your evidence is concerned, you don't even mention the point. In other words, it's not a concept that even gets a word, notwithstanding everything else that you've had to say about these proposals and your proof of evidence and your rebuttal and the position you took in terms of the statement of common ground. You haven't mentioned it at all, have you?
Mr. Village, there's a terminology absence. There's a terminology absence, but if you look at tables 3.5 and 3.6, that is our rebalancing exercise, and it shows the level of cremations that each one of those sites will actually perform if this appeal goes ahead. So that is a rebalancing exercise. If you take Mr. Best's own words, which he very helpfully outlines in 10.1 of his proof, his own words, to quote them, because I think it's important in this case, is he says, I now turn to consider the issues of impact and rebalancing. Rebalancing is essentially an exercise in forecasting what the effect of the proposed development will be on the balance of cremations undertaken at the appeal site and other relevant existing committed crematoria. That is what tables 3.5 and 3.6 do.
Yeah, well, the fact that you say it's a terminology absence, what you provide in 3.5 and 3.6 is nothing more than your final conclusion as to where the cards fall at the end of the day. You haven't actually gone on to rebalance after the initial openings have taken place, have you?
That is exactly what that does. That is a mature level of cremations in each case.
Yeah. Well, you haven't shown the stage before it, if that's the case, have you?
What's the stage before it that I'm missing?
Well, the stage of where, in mathematical terms, what the answers are simply, if it's simply based on a mathematical equation.
No, that's exactly done in the populations that are in the previous tables.
Yeah, and in 3.5 and 3.6, those again are entirely, those tables are entirely based upon a mathematical, effectively a calculation, rather than any element of judgment as to how in due course there will be a change as people decide, for different reasons other than proximity to a crematorium, that they will go to a different one.
Mr. Village, in responding to your point, I'd turn you to Mr. Best 10.49, where he says, it is not possible to accurately forecast crematorium choices using criteria other than convenience. We agree with Mr. Best's proportion, because anything that's in Mr. Best's proof after making that statement is pure guesswork, to quote
No, it's planning judgment. And I think, with great respect, Mr. Hodgson, and I know this must be difficult for you to understand as a non-planner, those are judgments which planners have to undertake.
Mr. Best, I would say,
Keep calling me Mr. Best, it's Mr. Village.
Many apologies. Mr. Village, I am very aware of what it takes and what actually happens when you open a new crematorium set against an older existing provision. I've done it 11 times. So in terms of judgment, I think I am qualified to make said judgment, having had the experience of doing so. And as I mentioned in my evidence in chief, we have seen, using the MDC as the 100%, sites plateau at 85% and sites get up to 130%. The average is 107 across our 11 crematoria. The point being that to get 100% on its own with those qualitative factors that you rightly allude to is very challenging. So to go above it, you can do. To go significantly above it is difficult. To do it with any consistency or accuracy is impossible to project. And I say that as an operator.
Yeah, well, I'm not, as I've already said to you, I'm not going to indulge in a debate about the approach of Mr. Best, and in particular the approach of Mr. Best at the Wergs inquiry, which was a wholly different set of circumstances. But I think I've taken that as far as I need to. You describe it as an absence of terminology. I would simply say it's an absence of methodology. Okay, I think, just give me a moment. Just let me check, please, with my team as to whether or not there's anything else I need to ask you. Madam, thank you very much indeed for that. And Mr. Hodgson, I'm very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. Those are all my questions.
Thank you, Mr. Village.
Thank you, Mr. Village. You've come right in on time there. Just give me a couple of minutes. I'm just, I will have some questions for you. I just want to check which ones have already been covered. Just hold on. Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. Probably, well, more points of clarification. Just having a look at paragraph 9.25 of Mr. Best's proof. If you could bring that up, please.
Sure. Yes, I have that.
Just it was kind of touched on in cross-examination, but I'd like to explore it a bit further. The fact that the Barnby Dun site the natural catchment area does not stop at 45 minutes, and that it extends beyond there, reflecting the sort of additional areas to the northeast, as the the proposed operator, Barnby Dun. I'd be interested in your view on that, please.
Insofar as, do I agree that it will extend out that far?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, generally, there's a lot that will depend once you get over a certain amount of distance, and I'm quite assured by the fact that the population in that northeastern area is not as dense, and therefore will not make a huge difference to the level of cremations being undertaken. But if you look at the MDC that we have produced and the population levels that come from that area, I would suggest that it's less than 10%, and then it will depend really about the associations of those people and whether they would be prepared to come and use the site. There are a lot of factors in that. Funeral directors' opinion, whether they can gravitate down towards Doncaster, or whether they actually, associate themselves with a town further north, which sometimes would mean that they wouldn't necessarily come. But my view is that in general, the MDC that's produced in map 1.1 of my proof is an accurate reflection, and there's not a good or a big proportion of population that is attributable to that level, to that position.
Okay, so even if it did extend to, beyond that, the 45-minute catchment, it would, because of the fact the population is not very dense, it wouldn't have a huge impact on numbers. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. Obviously, Mr. Mitchell produced the late evidence in terms of the impact on, of Barnaby Down and Barnaby Moor, and the fact that it could take sort of 7 years to fulfil their potential, if you like, and have an impact on Rose Hill and other crematoria. What's your view on that in terms of in terms of Mr. Mitchell's position there, that it would take that long to reflect accurately the trading positions of the new crematoria?
It's a difficult one, insofar as I think that we are already getting a certain proportion, as obviously as the operator of Barnby Moor, I'm privy to seeing the actual figures that have been diverted to the site from the south of Doncaster. And there are one or two funeral directors in particular that like coming to Barnby Moor purely because of the difference in quality. But I accept that Mr. Mitchell needed to mention something, because I think he had realised that Mr. Best had used the basis of his capacity analysis using a 2017 to 2019 cremation level as the base. Now, we fundamentally don't do that. We do the diversions first using the GIS, and then we use the redrawn catchment areas as the basis of understanding the catchments and its impact on capacity. We do that because that, for us, location is what drives someone's choice first and foremost. And I accept that there are qualitative factors that can make people travel further. But the position that Mr. Mitchell was concerned about, I think, is that Mr. Best hadn't factored in those changes from Barnby Moor, because when he takes his three averages, Barnby Moor has only been open for 9 months in the 2019 figures, and of course wasn't open at all in 2017 or 2018. And so then, therefore, when you're using that base for calculating the capacity, you're starting from the wrong spot. So I accept Mr. Mitchell's view on that. It wasn't relevant to us, because as long as you plug in the locations of the existing sites, including Barnby Moor and Brodsworth, then it doesn't make any difference, because you're not using that erroneous base level, which Mr. Best uses. So I accept that Mr. Mitchell is correct, that it can take up to 7 years to reach a maturity. However, I do believe in this case that in 2020 and 2021, we've seen a sort of early move towards those figures. And then if you take a level of pressure away at Barnby Dun, once that is developed, then that impact may not continue to increase at a strong level. It may plateau. But of course, what Mr. Mitchell is doing is looking at 2019 figures. So it might not take us 7 years, is the point, Marm, to get there. Sometimes it can happen sooner, but then it doesn't continue to increase. It plateaus at that level.
And your view, would this particular point result in a sort of an underestimation of the potential impact of those new crematoria on the existing crematoria and the capacity of the existing crematoria?
I believe that the capacity analysis that sits within section 5 of my proof is accurate, and therefore I don't believe that the capacity or the viability, I can't comment on viability for the council because I don't know what cost base they have or anything like that. But what I would say is that based on the capacity analysis that I have done within section 5 of my proof, the level of cremations expected at Doncaster, Brodsworth and Barnby Dun, if they all went ahead, shouldn't render below a certain level. So you know, the way we calculated it wasn't impacted by Mr. Mitchell's evidence. So taking mine as correct, I don't believe it would put pressure on a sort of minimum level of cremations at Rosehill.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Mr. Hodgson. Those are my questions. Thank you very much. Mr. Barrett, would you like to commence re-examination?
Thank you, ma'am. We've got very little for you, Mr. Hodgson. Can I begin with the active exchange limited material, which is Appendix 1 of your evidence? I don't think you need turn it up.
Okay.
Mr. Best, of course, produced rebuttal evidence. Is there anywhere in that rebuttal that questions the credibility of the exercise conducted in your Appendix 1?
No, and you know, what's telling is that Mr. Best, instead of producing a similar Appendix 1 that sits within my Appendix 1, so the Appendix 1 to the active exchange report, which sets out the correct speed methodology, it's telling that instead of providing that, Mr. Best seeks to use several desktop suppliers of journey time analysis, Waze, Google, the AA, which have a far lower level of accuracy and flexibility than the GIS software that we both use in ArcGIS and Map Info Professional. So I do question that because, again, I've continually tried to reconcile the differences between us, and I've been unable to do it on that position.
That's the next point, Mr. Hodgson. Having identified the differences between you, although you're using similar GIS software that should only produce a difference of perhaps 2%. Is that right? You gave that evidence earlier. Is that about right? Whereas the difference is actually significantly more than that. Can you give the inspector the figure of what the difference actually is between your evidence and that of Mr. Best and to some extent Mr. Mitchell?
It varies, but I think Mr. Best obviously shows the different diversions. So I think overall, you're looking at overall conclusions of around 12 to 15% difference. And it's difficult to understand why. It's interesting that the appellant has chosen to supply a new core document in our active exchange report that went with the original application. I'm actually grateful for that because if, Ma'am, you want to turn up the Appendix 1, you don't have to turn it up now, but you know, if you, as a sort of side thing, you will see that the speeds that are in that report, that went into that report for our same application process, are identical to the ones that are appended to the active exchange report that sits at Appendix 1 of my proof. So further sort of evidencing and confirming that we've used a consistent approach in our methodology.
And could your methodology be replicated by either Mr. Mitchell or Mr. Best?
We've used ArcGIS before, so we know all about it. What is consistent is the speeds that you use, that they're manually inputted. So whenever you put in the speeds, that will then translate into what actually gets produced. What's interesting in general is it seems that, and I believe this is probably in fairness, that there might not be a discrepancy on or any difference on speeds. I believe the major difference will come down to the reason we stopped using ArcGIS, which is that it's very difficult to discount motorway use. And there are a lot of motorways around these sites. And it is my belief that the manual workaround that you have to do to take that out of ArcGIS can change the impact that you get. But to be clear, motorways shouldn't be factored in, because funeral directors do not use motorways when they access a crematorium site. So that's the only reason we switched from ArcGIS, which is a perfectly respectable piece of software, but again, you have to use it properly.
In terms of direct cremations, can I ask you to turn to the needs statements for common ground, please?
Yes. Just got to turn that up 1 second. Yes, I have that.
Section of paragraph 2.6, the words in brackets. What is the position with regard to the use and the application of direct cremation services to the calculation of capacity at existing crematoria and future crematoria?
We're all agreed on the parties in that point. You know, we all agree that direct cremations do not put any pressure on the offering, the qualitative offering, the pressure of the site in offering a service time, because direct cremations tend to be delivered at the beginning of the day and or at the end of the day potentially as well. So they put no pressure on that capacity analysis or calculation. As a result, they are agreed between the parties being reduced. It's just the level that we're not agreed upon.
Now, the position that was put to you by Mr. Village was that the pandemic has influenced direct cremation rates such that the figures for the last 2 years are, this is not his word, it's mine, are suspect, because there was a criteria at which only a limited number of people could attend funerals, and that may well have inflated what appears to be direct cremations. In respect of non-direct cremations, you gave the figure of self-evidently about 90%.
Yes, about 88.5% in 2020 were recorded as attended services.
Now, whilst the number of people would be materially affected by those who could attend during the pandemic, would that affect those who would wish to attend some form of service, albeit a limited number of people could attend, a cremation service during the course of the pandemic?
I want to be completely fair here, because there is a chance that would have had an impact, but in reality, the two things are happening at the same time, with a huge growth in direct cremation anyway, with the introduction of our scheme for direct cremation, which started in 2016. The appellant is getting going in 2018. Westerly have now introduced it in 2020, and now every crematorium in the land offers a direct cremation. That was not the case in 2019. Now, I don't think the pandemic had any impact on that movement. I think that it's fair to say, because you just don't know the reality of the situation, that some people would have been discouraged in coming to a funeral. But in our experience, there was still a huge desire to attend services, hence why 88.5% still did. Direct cremation as a principle is a completely different idea that gives more flexibility to the bereaved family, and it is that people are attracted to. So that part has no impact or no position driven by the pandemic. It is a move in the industry, which is why so many people now, in terms of providers, are putting focus on it, because of course, when the public say we want something, we as suppliers of that public service have to respond, and that is what's happening.
And the final point I want to ask you about is rebalancing. Can I ask you to turn to your tables 3.5 and 3.6?
Got those.
You began your discussion with Mr. Village by drawing attention to paragraph 10.49 of Mr. Best's evidence, where he says it's difficult to anticipate what people will do.
Yes.
Is that consistent or inconsistent with the market report that's in evidence before us, the Competition and Markets Authority report? Is Mr. Best's position about it's very difficult to predict how people will react even if there's a new super duper brand new facility available?
Well, 10.49 is actually very consistent with the CMA's position, which effectively says that convenience and distance is the main driver. The CMA don't advance any capacity issue within their report. There's a lot of quoting by the appellant to the CMA. I note that Mr. Village never took me to any of that, but I would say that the CMA's positioning is that there's no capacity issues. I think they cite that another 10 crematoria could be built in the country. And I think that sort of spins me back around to this 80% point, because the CMA didn't say there was a capacity issue. If you take the 80% figure as a either acceptable or unacceptable point, then you would need to build another 100 plus crematoria in this country, because there are at least 100 crematoria that currently sit over that 80% measure. So that's the difference, unfortunately, between us, as much as Mr. Villager and I didn't agree on that point. The CMA in general make no attempt. Their major position is that price and price competition was needed, and therefore that is their main driver of all of their conclusions, insofar as they say, yes, you know, people will only travel to their nearest crematorium in the majority of cases. And what's interesting is that is completely consistent with 10.49 and Mr. Best's proof, where I agree with him. It's impossible to identify what that's going to be. Our experience is that we've got 11 new crematoria and they're all different, and yet they all were surrounded by older provision, and we took 100% of the MDC as our rebalancing position, and we have gone above that in a couple of cases, and we've stayed below it in a couple of others. So, you know, we have in general gone above, and you will reach further out of your catchment area. I don't deny that, but to get 100% of everything that's closer to you is also a challenging proposition. So to just simply add 20 to 30%, which is Mr. Best's new position on this, and I do note Mr. Village said that my characterisation of Mr. Best's rebalancing at this site is wrong. I can't find it anywhere in Mr. Best's proof where it's outlined, apart from the 20 to 30% suggestion that features in section 10. So to be clear, I do not accept that you as a new crematorium provider would get an additional 20 to 30%. And given that one of those competitors is going to be Barnby Dun in this case, does that mean that we can reach into the appellant's catchment area and also take 20 to 30% from them, given that we've got a higher, a high qualitative offering as well? All I can say is I don't know, because it's impossible to know when you look at the evidence.
That leads us to the rationale in table 3.5 and 3.6 then. First of all, will that reflect a mature market? The point that Mr. Mitchell was concerned about him producing his need statement.
Yes, we work on a premise that you can get up to 100% of your MDC, but that you might take 5 to 7 years to do it. And so that ties back to Mr. Mitchell's concerns over the omission when calculating that base position of using 2017 to 2019 figures for Rose Hill, that they hadn't had opportunity to address the fact that 2 other crematoria existed. By doing it this way, you take out that potential for error, because you're redrawing the catchment areas, and you're saying at maturity, table 5 is based on 2021 figures is where you'd expect to get to, and 3.6 is where you expect to get to in the future in 2033.
And how has that played out in terms of Memoria's experience of using the MDC as the appropriate basis for its judgments in terms of development opportunities that it wishes to pursue?
Well, when you're looking at this, you know, you have to look at it from a need and a planning perspective, but you also look at it from viability and justifying what is a significant investment. So the MDC presents a very useful factor that we know, based on convenience, based on the higher level of quality that you can offer, you can get 100%. What I don't agree with is that you can naturally get more, because to get 100% on your own as a new provider is challenging. As time progresses, you can stretch out, but you also have a number of families that have been to other sites before that will continue to use that site if they've had a positive experience. And of course, by your very existence, you do bring down those levels of usage at the other sites as well, which is why it's important really to do these capacity and MDC assessments to understand that. Because if you're not having a big impact on those sites, then of course you might be able to add some other qualitative factors. But if you are bringing those levels down, then the MDC presents a very fair position. And as I said, despite certain sites where we've been surrounded by older crematoria that are very busy, we haven't always got to 100% of our MDC. One particular example in, say, Amber Valley in Derbyshire, where we're surrounded by 4 older crematoria, and we have reached 85%. We've been open 5 years. Why? Because actually we're finding that the people within our MDC, some of the people on the edge of those MDCs gravitate towards the major centres of Derby to the south and Chesterfield to the north, because that's where they go and do their shopping. And so they naturally can't bring themselves to go south or north in the case of places like Belper and Heanor and Clay Cross in the north. So I look at this day in, day out, and I think the point I'm making, and Mum, for you to take in, is this: that there is no way of knowing what is going to completely transpire when you open a new crematorium in terms of the
Which
numbers.
takes us back to Mr. Best's evidence at 10.49.
Correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodgson. I have no further questions of you.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Hodgson. You may now relax, Mr. Hodgson. Can I just have the parties back just to discuss timings, please? We are now due to hear from the appellant's witness, Mr. Lathbury. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Lathbury, Mum.
Lathbury. So, I mean, I'm flexible. Mr. Village, would you rather have lunch and sort of flow through, or would you rather do evidence in chief before lunch? It's entirely, but I'm entirely flexible.
Thank you. I think we'd prefer to have lunch and resume at 1:25 or 1:30, whatever's convenient.
Is that acceptable to Mr. Barrett, Mr. Robson?
Perfect, as far as I'm concerned, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, we'll have an early lunch, and we shall resume at 1:25. Thank you very much. I shall adjourn the inquiry.
So.